Often we think we know, but maybe we don't. Welcome to Talking to Strangers, Malcolm Gladwell's book that we are digging into here at Painted Porch Strategies. I'm Rob, the MC, the Master of Communication, joined by Chief Evolution Officer, Amy Yak. She's the founder and CEO. And then right there is our radical mindfulness, our mindfulness Sherpa, Sarah Ramkamp. So I want to know, as we get into the final part of this book from you two lovely ladies, what are your takeaways from this book? Now that we're done, what is sitting in your brain as like, because this for me blew my mind.
I will say I'm conflicted. I walked away with this feeling a little conflicted in both good, in good ways, in that a lot of what Malcolm Gladwell is talking about in this book is don't judge a book by its cover, lead with a bit of trust, but also don't necessarily default to trust all the time in all situations. So I'm a little conflicted. I walked away going, okay, I'm supposed to be trusting of people, because if I'm not, it's going to be very difficult for me to navigate in this world in any type of clear mind. But also at the same time, recognize that there are people who may not have everyone's best interests at heart.
Sierra?
You know, this book, I finished it and I said, this was definitely a Rob book. I can see why Rob was really drawn to this author. It's very newsy. It's very like, there's lots of information, but I felt like he kind of just kept yanking me around. Like, it was like, and now I'm going to talk about this, and now I'm going to talk about this. And there was a lot of information for me where I felt like my head just continued to swim. And then I thought, well, you know what? Maybe this is actually his purpose. Maybe his purpose is not for me to feel all like, okay, that's the end, nice and tidy. I think his purpose was to stir us up, to make us feel very like pulled back and forth, like, what? I don't know. Is that like the goal, to just like stir it up, like Bob Marley would sing about, stir it up?
That's a very interesting point too. My personal take on that, on your opinion, Sierra, is the complexities of human beings. So you think about this. We're all products of our own environments, experiences, and beliefs. The only perspective we truly have is our own. Sure, we can broaden ours by listening to others, but we still only have our own. We only represent ourselves in that moment. And the three of us talking creates an infinite amount of possibilities based on something I say that Sierra might interpret one way and Amy might interpret a completely different way. And I might intend to be different than both of your interpretations. And you add that into all of the human interactions we have, and you can understand why he bases this, Gladwell does, in Talking to Strangers, on the case of Sandra Bland, who was pulled over for failure to use a directional signal in Prairie View, Texas, 50 miles outside of Houston. But what we learn in the book is that her interpretation of the event is that the cop sped up behind her, so she was trying to get out of his way, so she's panicked, as we all tend to be, at least most of us, when pulled over by a police officer. There's already a heightened state of fear. So now Sandra's fear interacts with the officer's fear, who is becoming scared of her because she's moving around because of the way this officer's been trained. Digging into the layers of all of this is what's super intriguing. Because I want to go back to you, Amy, and ask, is this book going to change the way you interact with human beings because of your complexity?
I would say yes. Both, I'm not going to say good and bad. I would say yes, it is going to impact the way that I communicate or talk to strangers. You know, one of the things that we talk about a lot, that the Stoicism, which is what our organization, our company is built on, is the idea of taking different perspectives. and not necessarily jumping to conclusions or labeling people a certain way. And so I think through that, we were already practicing, and I've been trying to practice, and Stoicism is a practice, trying to take that perspective a little bit more. Again, not judging a book by its cover, taking that one step back to assess a situation maybe a little bit more objectively. But this causes me to do it, I think, even more. It creates some wonderful examples of where that can go when you don't do that, when you place people in pre-constructed boxes or assumptions of behavior, how that can often lead you astray. And so I think for me, that's really one of the big things, that I'm just going to embrace the pause and the moment of reflection a little more than because I think even before this, while I would try to step into someone else's shoes, or at least take a step back and get a different perspective, I still was operating under certain pre-programmed assumptions and judgments.
As we all are.
Yeah. So I would say that from this, yes, it's causing me to just be a little bit more reflective before I react, a little bit more nuanced in how I'm interpreting a particular person or situation.
What about you, Sierra? Has anything in this book changed how you view our fellow humans or how you'll interact with them?
I actually think it made me feel more gun shy about, made me want to just shut my mouth and just listen. And yeah, I don't know. A little intimidating as far as all the things that you may think are simple or that you may think are obvious. Like I love the example they used about the man who'd come from another country, and he was used to, when the authorities stopped you, you immediately took out your papers. In his culture, that was what you immediately did. Whereas an American, I think, immediately, like, don't move your hands, because that's kind of how you've been, whether you're pulled over for a ticket or whatever. It's like that freeze standpoint. So it almost makes me want to just kind of do nothing, just wait and watch, deer in headlights.
Well, that's the interesting part about this, because it could definitely give you that, because there's so much information that our brains aren't really designed to process, particularly in the moment. Like our brain, there's 400 billion bits of information coming at us, sights, sounds, smells, things we don't even pick up on, that the brain's trying to narrow down to keep you alive. That's its main function. So it's understandable why we jump to conclusions. But ultimately for this book, it's a book about communication, which is one of our tenets here at Painted Porch Strategies, because it's vitally important to every human life. The greatest invention of humanity is a language, in my opinion, because it took us and created the ability to understand each other. Whereas animals in the wild have different modes, right? It's much simpler, yes. Yeah. Whereas there's nothing simple about this brain that we have and these interactions and these infinite possibilities. But it shows the importance of it. And you guys touched on something very interesting. It's, number one, understand you have assumptions and biases. And they're not always right, but they're not always wrong either. I know that's a super simple thing to say, but it's complex like that. Sometimes you get it right. Sometimes your life might actually be in danger. Most of the time it's not. And you're going to operate as if in some way that it is, that you're trying to survive. It's your automatic autopilot thing to do. But that doesn't mean it has to control you. And the other part too, with listening that you brought up, Sierra, that's really the key to this entire book. The key to, I know you can't see it. Ours is white. Sarah's got the red one.
Sierra's got the red one.
But listening is huge. So there's the concept that I talk about in my program called Master Your Message, about the 5 whys. And this goes back to Toyota in Japan. So if something went wrong, they asked 5 why questions to really find out what the root cause of the problem was. So for example, if they didn't produce enough cars, like, well, we didn't make our mark. Instead of just saying, okay, we need the people to work hard, I said, why did we not meet that mark? Oh, it came down that maybe they weren't trained. Okay, well, why weren't they trained properly? Well, they weren't trained properly because of this. Okay, so why was that policy in place? So they keep digging in. And I think that that is the approach that could have happened with Sandra Bland and the officer.
Mm-hmm.
Had he actually listened to her and communicated to her, this whole thing could have been avoided. And that's what I think Gladwell is getting at here, is that by understanding we have biases, we have emotions, and in this case, the Sandra Bland and the cop were both operating under fear, which does crazy things to your brain, as he points out in the last part of the book, because you don't think rationally now. Certain parts of your brain turn off. So you can understand why Sandra Bland was agitated, particularly with her story that the cop doesn't know. She'd been pulled over, 10 times for parking violations and various traffic violations, and ended up $8,000 in debt because of them. So naturally, she's going to get nervous and fearful when she's pulled over. But he doesn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
But if he asks her, hey, you appear to be a little frustrated or agitated. Can I ask you why? And maybe she says, yeah, you know what? I've been pulled over 10 times in the last 5 years, and I ended up paying $8,000 in fines, and it really was difficult. So I'm out here in Texas trying to restart my life. And that adds, which is true, that adds a different perspective to the story. But oftentimes in those moments, particularly of fear, we're really only thinking about ourselves because that's what our body and brain are designed to do.
Yeah.
It's getting outside of that when it's not a life-threatening situation that will help further understanding. But it all does come back to how we communicate to each other and how inquisitive we are and how understanding we are of other perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of this book. It's titled Talking to Strangers, but essentially what he has illustrated throughout this entire book is that we are not actually talking to one another. We are primarily interpreting, but we are not connecting. We're not actually communicating to understand. If we communicated to understand, then many of these situations that were played out in this book, I think, would have very different outcomes if we simply approached the act of communicating differently than how we do today, or how these people did today.
Mm.
And he brings up another element here. So he has 3 elements that really interrupt human to human interactions. First being default to truth, which Amy brought up. And what that means is I'm going to assume that Amy and Sierra are telling me the truth because I'm a human being. And humanity can only really work if there is a level of trust, which right now I think pandemic, Trump years, I think there is a very big lack of trust going on right now. There's tons of information coming from all different angles. So that, I think, as a group, as a collective, we got to work on.
Mm-hmm.
Almost like we have to default to the truth, because if we don't, we all become holy fools, which I am, especially when it comes to power.
And what is the holy fool?
The holy fool is someone that doesn't default to truth, that thinks there's a scallywag around every corner.
Yeah.
Someone trying to take advantage of me. Everybody's a Bernie Madoff. And if everyone operated like that, no one would get anything done because no one would trust each other. The second element, what was that, Sierra?
Skeptic.
Yes, a skeptic. The second element is transparency, in that we think, okay, if Amy and Sierra are going to be shocked, they're going to look the same way. They're going to make the same facial expression. But that's not true. But we think that it is.
Right. And it's not true both just personality, experience, circumstance, and culture, right? Sierra, you brought up a good point just a little bit ago. They talk about in the book how when it comes to police officers and CIA agents and all those different folks, they're trained to look for certain visual cues. It tells, yeah. Eye contact, the way, where somebody looks when they're talking, if they touch something, if they're fidgeting, all of those different things they use as cues and clues as to whether or not someone is telling the truth or is trying to hide something. But the reality is that is not standard behavior for every single human being that walks on this earth. So, for example, if you are not from a Western culture and you get pulled over by a police officer in the United States, they're trained to look for people who are looking them directly in the eye, who aren't fidgeting, who are, to your point earlier, like, oh, I'm actually not going to do anything yet until I'm told to do so. But someone from another culture, they might look down because looking at someone is considered a sign of disrespect versus respect. Exactly. So that's where that idea of transparency and what Malcolm refers to as being mismatched, how the expected behavior, what people expect to see, doesn't match what the individual might actually be thinking or feeling. But because you're expecting a certain external outcome, they can be mismatched, like in Amanda Knox's case.
Or Sandra Bland's case.
Or Sandra Bland's case.
And she ended up, in that worst case scenario.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So then the third thing is coupling, which is what he introduces in the last part of the book. So we have default to truth, we have transparency, and coupling. Now, he uses very morbid examples.
Yep.
And, if you're going to read the book and you're following along with us, you'll get to this point or have read this point where he talks about Sylvia Plath, the poet, and how she committed suicide was convenient. Because at the time in Britain, they had, what was it called? City gas?
Town gas.
Town gas. And it didn't really leave any marks. You basically just went to sleep. So what she did is she opened her oven, turned it on, boom, rest of the story, right? So what they found is when they changed away from that gas, the number of suicides dropped. So the increase in suicides during those years in the UK is related to the fact that it was relatively easy. So in bringing that up and tying it to Sandra Bland, it was she suicidal when she got pulled over? Probably not. But she's in a cell thinking her life is crumbling behind her because she just got arrested for a felony assault of a police officer. Right. Ridiculously. So she, in that moment, coupled together being in that cell with all of those things, took her own life. Mm-hmm. And that is the ultimate worst case scenario of miscommunication between strangers. That is the worst case scenario when you're mismatched, when you add coupling, when you
don't default
to truth, when you are not, understanding each other. So I think that that's what Gladwell does so well, is highlight one worst case example and say, okay, what can we all learn from this? And that's my main takeaway, is that don't run from complexity, embrace it, because complexity is real. You don't really know where someone stands unless you ask them a bunch of questions, and you do it in a non-threatening way. That's the best way. Now, if you're an officer, you might have to do it in a different way. You might have to be more aggressive with certain people, but I don't know, maybe not. So in wrapping this up, final takeaways from Malcolm Gladwell's Talking to Strangers.
This was a really complex book. This stirred up a lot of things with a lot of examples that even Rob was saying, this brought new things to life that he didn't know. And some of these cases, some of these events, he thought he knew pretty well, and yet this was new information. So for me, my takeaway is yet another blaring example of why you need to maintain a growth mindset. Is don't be too fixed in your opinions, your perspectives. Be open enough to grow, to change your mind, to think again, to understand that someone's journey may be very different from your journey, and it might look really different. So whether or not you can truly understand is just stay open and stay growing, because you're not who you were yesterday.
Beautifully said. I think to add to that, in addition to having that growth mindset and being open to having actual communication with other people, both of those pieces are vital to us collectively as a people working together to better ourselves, to better our relationships, to better the world. That's only going to happen if we're willing to take these steps of being open to new perspectives, new ideas, being willing to ask why and dig a little bit deeper in your communication. So that way you can collectively make change possible and collaborate for growth for yourself and for what this world truly needs. We need more Sandra Blands, we need less.
Because to go to your points, and I'll put a little cherry on top, is treat everybody as if we're a teammate. Treat everybody you encounter like we're on the same team.
Mhm.
Because when you're on the same team, you're working towards that same goal. So in the sports analogy, it's to win games and ultimately try to win a championship. What if we all approached each other that same way? You know what? We might not always agree. And we might have to give each other some feedback every now and again. We might have to get real with some people and actual talk to them about the truth. But if we did that and we did it in the right way and we remained grounded in understanding, except in those cases where it's a real threat, and we treat each other as teammates, that's when we can collaborate and work together exactly like the Stoics intended, that human beings are meant to collaborate. And when we do come together, there's really nothing we can't accomplish.
Mhm.
That's what I think is the compare and contrast of how Gladwell tells this book. He uses the most extreme example of how it can go wrong to teach us what the opposite could be if we're willing to do the work and become Stoics.
Mhm. Yeah, there's this African term that I've loved that I think is so beautiful. It's called sawubona. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's this term that it's used as a greeting in the African culture. And it basically means I see you, but it's I see you at a deeper level than just, oh, hi, yes, I see you're a person in front of me. It means more that I acknowledge you, I respect you, I see you. And I think that's a big thing here is that Malcolm's trying to teach us is how can we practice a little bit more sawubona, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. How can we practice a little bit more of that when we encounter strangers, so that way we don't jump to these conclusions, both good or bad, but to actually take a moment to see one another, to better communicate, better collaborate, better grow together as a people.
Always an adventure here on the porch.
And that's exactly why we call it Painted Porch Strategies, because these are the type of conversations they had on the painted porch back in the day. In fact, Stoicism was founded with that idea of human collaboration on a painted porch. So what are your takeaways? We'd love to find out. Talking to Strangers, Malcolm Gladwell. This was a book that changed the way I think about so many different things. So I'd encourage you to read it. I'd encourage you to let us know what you think. Give us a comment below. And of course, head over to paintedporchstrategies.com. Say hi to us. For Sierra, for Amy, I'm Rob. Talk to you again real soon.